we didn't just look at the environmental impact. We also looked at what's economically in it for the ship owner. Yeah, and ultimately we looked at the return on investment for the ship owner. And if you take the combination of in making these adjustments, reducing 25 or more % of your fuel consumption, which has a big advantage for the charterer, that translates into higher charter rates for the vessel.
Welcome to the Carbonsations podcast, where we speak to some of the leading figures in the emerging carbon industry. Joining us for today's episode is Edwin Sieswerda, founder and managing director of export finance firm Atal Solutions. Edwin, thanks so much for being on the show. Yours is a very curious sector and one I can't wait to understand more about, so we'll certainly dive deeper into that and what exactly Atal does. But in the meantime, it would be great to first take a step back and get to know your background a little bit better. So please do share with us how you ended up in the export finance business. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for having me on your podcast. I started, let's say, 25 years ago as a lawyer in the finance sector. Immediately from the start of my career, I got involved in export finance. Then mainly advising banks. After 10 years of law, I was retrained as a banker, worked with Rabo International and focused also in export finance within the bank. 7 years ago, I started Atal, what is today Atal, where we knew that the cornerstones of the business would be export finance and compliance. Excellent. Now, given your background, I guess it was logical for you to found a company like Atal, but nevertheless, could you share with us a little bit more of what inspired you to do so? Yeah, having worked in the corporate sector for 17 years, what really inspired me is a combination of my grandparents, who experienced the First and Second World War. And they always taught us that, if you are fortunate enough to be raised in a country like the Netherlands, you have a duty to do something in return for society. That on the one hand. On the other hand, when my son was born, my first son, that really inspired me to focus on impact and, making making the world a better place. Thank you. Edwin, moving on to Atal itself, can you share more about the kind of services that the company provides? Yeah. So what we do, in essence, is we're like a turnkey contractor for projects globally in 7 sectors, which is green shipping, green energy, schooling, healthcare, sustainable agriculture, infrastructure, and water and waste management. And what you can see in these sectors, they're all relevant when it comes to, building a sustainable society. In doing this, we support the economies of the exporting countries. Usually it can be Netherlands, can be Germany, can be UK. And we also support the economies and the well-being of existing and future generations in developing countries. Because most of the projects we do are in countries like Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. And that's in short what we do. And actually when providing, when working as a turnkey contractor, we add to that a minimum of 85% of the financing of the project. And either we provide the financing ourselves and we're funded, or we work together with traditional financial institutions. Okay. We'll also certainly get into some of the sectors that you work with, but specifically also wanted to ask you about export finance in and of itself. How is this sector approaching its climate impact? When it comes to export finance, that basically means you apply for a credit insurance with export credit agencies. They represent their government. So in the Netherlands, for instance, you have a Tradius Dutch state business who's representing the Dutch government. In Germany, you have Euler Hermes representing the German government, and so on. They are focused on, so the governments actually, through their export credit agencies, give a push towards a greener future. And so when it comes to green projects, you will get a lower insurance premium from, in order to cover the insurance for the credit, for the loan. That benefits. You will get longer repayment tenors. And they really see how they can actually give a push towards a greener future. Since export finance implies means of transportation and largely shipping, how can your sector help decarbonize across borders?
The advantage of export finance in projects, actually the advantage of export finance in combination with being a turnkey contractor is that when we get involved in projects, very often for a project owner, can be either a government or a private company. It's not always easy to realize a project. And when we get involved, we look at sort of how to realize that project. And we have a lot of tools to do so. Sometimes we involve external guarantors who guarantee the repayment of the credit in return for a stake in the transaction. But ultimately, we always look at how can you realize that kind of project. Then what happens is, for example, a biogas project in Greece. That's really focused on a more sustainable future and reducing agricultural waste and transforming that into energy. There we involved Dutch exporters, suppliers in the project. We purchase from all the from all the suppliers in the project, basically the whole project in order to deliver it turnkey. We add to that 85% of the financing insured by the Dutch government through a Trade Dutch State Business. And that's how we get the project approved. With the shipping project, we closed in March. We purchased vessels that were originally built in China and Japan. But then we involve suppliers from the Netherlands to make those vessels much greener than they are today. And the financing, again, the repayment is guaranteed actually by the Dutch government. And in this case, the funding comes from the US.
Sorry, just to clarify, this is the partnership with BAM Shipping, right?
Yes, that's correct. So, in every project, we look at, on the one hand, how can you decarbonize? How can you make it green? First of all, because it's good for the future. Secondly, because it also has financial benefits for the project owner. And even when you talk about, we're going to announce next week that we're doing so I'm sort of jumping the gun a little bit, a hospital project in India. But even there, when it comes to energy, we look for, solutions to work together with solar energy and, to make sure that the project is really sustainable.
And I'd really like to get into the details of that specific project. But before that, could you please share what your approach to risk management is when it comes to financing these technologies, particularly as carbon capture for shipping is such a new space and these technologies are evolving constantly?
Very good question. So what we do in every project we do, and that separates us sort of from the market, if you will, we do our in-house project analysis, full-blown, where we even, we have the capacity to check the engineering and to validate the engineering of a project. We have the sector expertise. We do the financial analysis. We do our KYC, our sanction analysis, our counterterrorism finance analysis. In general, let's say the compliance. We do our ESG analysis in-house. So we really check the whole project from A to Z. We make our own presentation for that project. And then together with all the underlying materials, we decide whether we believe in the success of that project or not. If we believe in it, we actually obtain credit insurance from an export credit agency and we obtain the financing. So far, we got 100% of our projects approved, which actually showcases our quality assessment of a project. That doesn't mean that every project, goes smoothly. When you start to implement the project, there are always things you need to resolve. But in the core, a project should be sustainable.
So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is how do you gain investor confidence in these projects?
The core, like I said, it's quality. So because we do our own assessment in a very critical way, we get the confidence of financial institutions. For example, it's not just that we are approached by governments and by private companies, also financial institutions that understand, who want to do a project, but who realize that they can only do a project by involving a company like ours. They approach us in order to assist them in doing a project. That to me is a real sign of confidence. They're trusting our quality assessment. And obviously, most financial institutions we work with, they have their own internal policies. And they, for instance, if they're not working in a certain country, they're not inclined to give a credit for a project in that country. So they only do it because there's credit or insurance coverage coming from an export credit agency. So that's a big part of it. But in order for us to convince an export credit agency to provide that insurance, they also have to trust sort of the quality of the materials we present to them. And like I said, until today, every project we presented has been approved.
So then to circle back to the partnership you mentioned earlier with BAM Shipping, which to our listeners who aren't familiar with the news, the project aims to both reduce emissions and save fuel. And as far as I know, you arranged for the credit of over $100 million for this project, which covers about 90%. I'm not quite sure the total amount. Just correct me if I'm wrong. So please just tell us more about the partnership, how it came to be, and also the kind of technological solutions that it involves.
So 4 years ago, we looked at the shipping market. And at that point in time, the project we're doing today wasn't feasible. First of all, it wasn't feasible because for the way we wanted to structure it, we weren't able to obtain the export credit insurance coverage from the Dutch government. So in order to do that, they had to change their policy. Together with DAM shipyards, we had ongoing discussions with Atradius Dutch State Business to change their policy in this respect. What happened is after the Glasgow conference, the policy was changed, which allows us to purchase second-hand vessels not built in the Netherlands, provided we buy the greenifying solutions from the Netherlands. So that was a sort of a game changer for us, because it means that we could say to Dutch suppliers, do not just focus on the smaller, specialized vessels, but you can also focus on vessels that are originally built in China, Japan, and South Korea. Those are usually the bigger vessels, and they're built there because mainly because it's cheaper to build them there. But when it comes to making a vessel green, the main cost is not always labor, it's also the technology you use. So there, it becomes easier for European suppliers to compete with countries like Japan and China and South Korea. So what we focused on is how can you make a project in which you use various types of solutions in order to make a vessel green. Yeah, we didn't stop there. We went how can you find various solutions, apply them in an integrated way, and achieve sort of the best possible result with today's proven technology. That took us a while to engineer, but finally we said if we take bulk carriers and we apply 9 different solutions to it, which are also aligned with the commercial approach of the shipping company, then we can reduce the fuel consumption with about 25 to 30%, maybe even more, we don't know yet. And we can reduce the carbon emissions with, just because of the fuel reduction, it's already a 25-30% reduction. But if you add to that carbon capturing, you can reduce it up to 99. Now, the 99, obviously, it's a bit theoretical, because you will only achieve that if you have a very efficient management of the tanks which capture the carbon. So to do this, we apply 8 to 9 different solutions. The first one is the duct. Maybe you've heard about it, the Mavis duct. It's a duct that's actually added behind the propeller of the vessel in order to streamline the water flow, creating more efficiency. We add to that the Damen air cavity system, which is like an air bubble that's underneath the vessel in order to reduce friction, and that saves fuel. We add what is called a variable frequency driver, LED lighting, an intersleek coating, which is a special coating on the outside of the vessel in order to reduce friction. We add a hybrid dry scrubber system and a CO2 capturing system. Obviously, the vessels need to have a ballast water treatment. And we also add a shore connection. And on top of that, we will add to the engines what is called Dex oil. It's a kind of a solution developed by NASA, and they sell it. And because you add it to the motor oil, it reduces friction inside the motor. And again, that results in less fuel consumption and less maintenance to the engine. Now, by applying all these various solutions, the result is, and the expected result, is that the vessels will be greenest existing vessels sailing on fossil fuel. This is, for us, the biggest advantage is we can actually implement this solution in 2 to 4 weeks. Obviously, you first need to do your engineering, but after you did your engineering, you have the equipment. The installation is about 2 to 4 weeks. And that, for us, is a fantastic way forward to reduce the carbon emissions of existing fleet in the world.
So how did you come up with the fact that you need all of these different solutions? Because normally when you're coming up with a solution, it's 1 or 2. not like 9 different ones.
Yeah, no, and that's also where, like I said, Klaas and V Group, Zenner, all the parties involved, they say that this has never happened in the world. Usually, like you said, ship owners choose 1 or 2, and they have a reduction of maybe 4 or 7% of fuel consumption. We were pushed by 2 things. One is our own drive to see how far we can actually reduce it. And the other thing is, when you use export finance, you need to have a minimum Dutch content. Now, when you purchase the vessel and you have to add that minimum Dutch content, it also means you have a certain expense. So we looked at, okay, what fits into that, in terms of solutions. And then we went up to basically 9 different solutions, which do not, because that's another very important thing, the different solutions we apply do not work against each other. That's very important. When you add a solution that basically works against another solution, that's not beneficial. So we also analyzed it from that angle. Yeah, and ultimately for these vessels and also the commercial point of view of the ship owner of BAM Shipping, we chose for these solutions. There are a few other solutions that are provided by Damen and companies, but we believe that for these vessels, in combination with the commercial strategy of the ship owner, that this is the best.
And you're saying that this combination of solutions is easy to replicate, easy for any fleet to adopt and instantly become greener.
Yeah, well, some of the vessels are slightly different. So you always have to do some engineering. You also have to discuss with the ship owner what is their commercial strategy. Because to give you an example, when you want to work with shore connection, shore power, if you're sailing on ports that do not have shore power, it doesn't really add value to your business. So that's an important one. And also, depending on the type of vessel, like these vessels have a flat hull. If you have vessels with a more round hull, then you can still use the air cavity system, which has been developed over the past years also for a round hull. But you really need to look at the specifics of the vessels. But most of the bulk carriers, they're very similar. So yeah, this can be applied to most of them. Yeah.
Okay. And so given your experience so far, perhaps with this project, but also with other projects in the industry, what would you say that the main challenges to decarbonizing shipping are?
Like everything that's new, even though it's proven, we're going through the phases, convincing all the various people involved. Initially, we had to convince, obviously, honestly saying, we even had to convince Damen that this was a good project. When they understood what we wanted to achieve and they bought into it and they really got focused, they really start to like it and they understand that this is the way forward. Then we also had to convince Atradius Dutch State Business that this is a good project and it's really good for the future of shipping. Then we had to look for a financial institution. Most of the financial institutions, the traditional banks, they weren't really receptive to the idea because they said, yeah, it's new. But obviously it's new. Even though it's proven technology, it's new. That was another sort of roadblock for us. Finally, we convinced MetLife to do the funding of the transaction. They were and are very supportive. They did do a full due diligence on the transaction and they liked what we're doing. And now, when we went to the ship managers, we actually had discussions with various ship managers, the bigger ones in the world, and they all understood the gravity of what we're doing here. And ultimately, V Group really wanted this project to be part of their business, also because they have a very strong focus on decarbonization and ESG. If you talk to Alessandro Chiocchi, who's the CCO of V Group, he will tell you that this is the way forward. The owner of Zenner, JD, he will tell you this is going to revolutionize or actually determine the way forward for the existing shipping sector for the next 10 to 15 years. Now, I hope that that's the case because it means that we did something good.
Realistically, though, do you see this approach kind of becoming more massive? And if so, how soon from now? Particularly with the IMO's, new regulations.
When you look at the project, we didn't look at only how do you make the existing vessels blue, if you will? Because it's, when you say green, it should be without fossil fuel. They will still continue to sail on fossil fuel, but we take away the negative effect or we mitigate them as much as possible. When you do that, we didn't just look at the environmental impact. We also looked at what's economically in it for the ship owner. Yeah, and ultimately, we looked at the return on investment for the ship owner. And if you take the combination of making these adjustments, reducing 25 or more % of your fuel consumption, which has a big advantage for the charterer, that translates into higher charter rates for the vessel. Well, with Dexoil, to give an example, your operational expenses are reduced. Yeah. So we also looked at, how can you reduce your operational expenses to the vessel? With the reduction of emissions, the vessel owner can do carbon emission trading. We know that it's still at a very early stage, but it's evolving, and it ultimately has economic benefits for the ship owner. And then on top of that, our solution exceeds all the requirements of IMO 2030. So the vessels, even though sanctions or taxes, if you will be imposed for vessels who are still having a lot of emissions, these vessels will not be subject to that. That also has an advantage to the ship owner and ultimately the charterer. So if you look at the economic impact of what we do, that really justifies the investment. And not to forget, the solution of the export finance allows a repayment period of 10 years in this case, even though you have a second-hand vessel. And obviously the vessel shouldn't be too old, but because you have the second-hand vessel and the retrofit and still a repayment period of 10 years with attractive terms, that makes it economically interesting for a ship owner. And that is why we also say, like, the combination is not just about the retrofit and the economic benefit, but also the financial solution that makes it really attractive.
And just a quick final question about this. Since there is ultimately a very big push in the world to phase out fossil fuels and, just completely move on to other alternatives, do you see other such alternatives being formed for shipping the way there is, for example, sustainable aviation fuel now?
Yeah, like the aviation industry is I would say sort of a different animal. Shipping is really regulated. Aviation is even more regulated. But if you look at airports, especially the bigger airports in the world, even though they differ in terms of size and stuff, it's easier to create a network of fuel, of alternative fuel. When you have shipping and you have a lot of different kinds of ports in the world, it's much more difficult to create an infrastructure for alternative fuels. You can see it with LNG. From the millennium, there was a push towards LNG. If you look at today's infrastructure for LNG, it's not sufficient to convince a lot of ship owners to switch to LNG. I don't believe in methanol at all. It's even more polluting. When you talk about dual fuel, I do believe in it. I think, especially for new vessels, you should always look at how to do the engineering of the vessel in a way that it can be easily adapted, to different types of fuel. But when you look at existing vessels, it's not so easy to change engine room. That's also a costly investment. Now, add to that, since the millennium, a push towards LNG. We're now 25 years later. Do I believe we're going to phase out fossil fuel? No, I don't believe in that. I'm sorry to say, but it's not going to happen. That's our economic reality. So in order to make our world a greener place, focus on mitigating the negative effects of it, which we can. If you look at our solution with the vessel, we can mitigate the negative effects of the emissions to such a level that it becomes environmentally sustainable. That's the best thing you can do. We're talking about, if you look at the global fleet at the moment, we're talking about 30,000 vessels, 30,000. In order to reduce the emissions of all those vessels to a level which is acceptable, like changing the engines of the vessels is not feasible. There's not even enough shipyards in the world to do it. It would take 30 years if you use all the shipyards in the world, decades, exceeding the economic life of the vessels. It's not possible. And this is what we're saying is focus on something that's realistic, practical, and easy to implement, and ultimately has the desired effect, which is taking away the negative effect. If we don't do that, we're not going to change the emissions in the shipping sector. We're just going to increase the cost of shipping. That will be the ultimate result. Because the governments will impose a sort of a tax, but who do you think is going to pay the tax? And what is the actual benefit? By introducing this solution, we actually show that there is a very economically viable solution in order to avoid the additional taxes, to achieve a significant reduction in emissions, to have a significant reduction in fuel consumption, and to have an economic benefit that justifies the investment.
Edwin, I have one final question before we wrap up this episode, which is also our last for this season. And that is whether Atal has any upcoming plans or announcements that we should look forward to. I know you mentioned the project in India, the hospital project. Anything else?
Yeah, very shortly, we're going to do a hospital project, the first out of 5 in India. We are about to close a food processing project in China, a waste pellet project in Ghana. And various projects.
You're all over the place.
Yeah, that's what we like.
Edwin, this was such a lovely conversation and a real pleasure to have you as a guest on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing so much of what the inside of decarbonizing the shipping industry looks like.
Thank you, Violet. It was our pleasure, and we'll be in touch.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Carbonsations podcast and would like to hear more conversations like this, please be sure to subscribe. We really appreciate the support.